Officers, we're all very interested in your evidence, and I have to give my colleagues a go, so I'm going to try and cut to some of the things that we could work on in the future. Senior Constable Wallace, in your statement, your first statement, you set out your thoughts on some recommendations for training going forward. You note that you've provided some training on 7 separate occasions at the NT Police College, and you've delivered several different streams of police training, including to advanced recruit squads, mainstream recruit squads and auxiliary squads. Each time there's been different time periods, and you make the point that best practice would say that each presentation should be the same consistent time period. Is that right?
That's correct.
Your recommendation is that the NT Police Internal Indigenous Cultural Training Program is established and staffed with appropriate police and Aboriginal liaison officers. Just to be clear, is there currently an NT Police Internal Indigenous Cultural Training Program, or are you suggesting that one needs to be set up?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm unsure whether that's part of the current Community Resilience Engagement Command's remit going forwards.
I see. What would it involve? What do you envisage?
Well, currently we've got 176 identifying Indigenous officers in Northern Territory Police in the role of constable of different ranks, with 66
Aboriginal community police officers.
The majority of which are local Northern Territory Aboriginal people. So we cover from the Tiwi Islands right down into the Pitlands and Central Desert. So we have pretty much Aboriginal representation within our ranks across the entirety of the NT. So what I'm suggesting is that we utilise that life skills and knowledge base from within to strengthen the understanding and the knowledge base of our members, particularly that are going to work in remote areas and regional centres of the Northern Territory.
And do you envisage that they are involved then continuously, that is, that there's a training package that is not just at the college when officers start, but that there's regular training involving those officers?
In a perfect world, yes. In an operational world, it may not be entirely possible, although we do have some incorporated training days in all of the rosters that I've worked with NT Police. It's not always possible given court and operational commitments to have that practice. The other thing I've suggested is that where members of the organisation have missed that training because they recruited earlier, that they're gathered when additional training at the college. So if they run a detective training program or a investigations program at the college, and people haven't had the opportunity to undertake appropriate cultural training, that it can be caught at that period of time.
Sergeant Allen, you mentioned earlier how valuable it was to have Senior Constable Wallace for the whole 3 days rather than just a period on the panel. Would you like to see an Aboriginal person embedded in the whole of the training program?
We have had that. And yes, it's very beneficial. Aboriginal Community Police Officer Glenn Kernan has taken an Aboriginal Community Police Officer program or course. Kyra Wilson was now working at Gove. She was recently part of the induction cohort, working in the same office as myself and my colleagues. And it's really easy for me to say, can you come and walk across the room and come down to the panel? She spoke of her story in front of the class. Yes, it is. I could see that obviously being of benefit, but we have experienced that previously. Right at this moment, in the induction team, there's no Indigenous officers in the induction team. Operational safety is another area. It's currently one. Yeah.
You spoke earlier, Senior Constable, about the numbers. 176 at the constable rank or within the rank, so it might be constable first class, for example. Do you know, and yourself, you're obviously a senior constable, do you know what the highest ranking is for an Aboriginal person in the force? You know that we can find out.
I honestly wouldn't be able to answer that.
In terms of recruitment strategy for the Northern Territory Police, it's an area that you also deal with in your statement, Senior Constable. It's obviously an area that you feel passionate about, the need to recruit local Aboriginal people in particular.
Yeah, well, a policing service should represent the community it polices. There's a whole array of issues that affect the sheer numbers that would be required to reflect that in the Northern Territory. However, best practice would be for us to attempt to gain the highest number of entrants that we can, because I think from my own experience and from watching other experienced Aboriginal police officers working within the community in Central Australia in particular, the skill sets that they bring to the table in the forms of language, knowledge base, kinship, can go a long way to dealing with some of the situations that we have. And it's also embedded ongoing training for members that are working with them day to day in how to deal with the community. I think it's beneficial. It's not saying that non-Aboriginal police officers aren't effective in their role. There's so many good police officers that I've worked with in the Northern Territory. Over the last 2 years, I've been fully employed in the prior 8 before that, where I was a special constable, and I have great admiration for some of the people that I've worked with. But the more Aboriginal police officers we can get, the better off this organisation is going to be. The particular challenge that we have in that aspect, and it was the same as the challenges that I saw while I was working for the Federal Police, is when we're doing targeted recruitment for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Island people throughout Australia and the Northern Territory, we're competing with every other government department, with every non-government organisation and the private sector for the best. And that's always a difficult concept to achieve.
Can I ask you, what made you want to be a police officer and stay being a police officer?
I grew up between Darwin and Alice Springs. I was a pretty rough kid. I didn't always have positive interactions with the police, but I had a particular interaction with a detective sergeant in Alice Springs who's now deceased, who invested a little bit of time in me and showed some faith in me and assisted me in some of my life decisions. He was a bit of a mentor. At the time, I applied for the Northern Territory Police, for the military and for the AFP. I was successful for the 3. My mum had a conversation with me and suggested that I wasn't mature enough within myself to police my own community. So I took the opportunity with the Australian Federal Police at that time. And I think it was probably sound advice given the challenges that I've seen since I've been working back here. I joined the police because the conversations that I had with my family members in the 1980s and 1990s were about a lot of the negativity that came with the associated trauma and the dealings that my people had had with the police leading up to, obviously, my time, and the way that we weren't particularly happy with those interactions. And it was pointed out to me that I can march up and down outside the station with a placard all day, and what I could achieve may be limited. I could join and I could attempt to make changes from within. So hence, I'm here at this inquest talking to you today.
And you feel like there have been significant changes since the time that you started?
Since 1998, when I first started, the banter day-to-day that I see in the workplace is totally different. The accepted language and behaviours that I see in the workplace are totally different. I think it's also a generational change where the generations of police officers that we're seeing undertake roles in this organisation and my previous organisation have gone through different prospects of schooling, so the introduction of social media. I mean, there's a wide range of things that have impacted the attitudes of our youth today, and it doesn't just go towards Indigenous people. It goes towards people's attitudes towards the ethnic community, the gay, lesbian, transgender community. The acceptance of people wider in mainstream Australia today is totally different to what it was in the 1990s. So the attitudes of police officers, in my view, reflect those changes in society for the bulk of the time, which is why it's so disappointing that some of the stuff in this inquest has come to light, because we don't see that, or I don't see that day to day, and if I did, I certainly wouldn't tolerate it.
No. We've heard that there are a significant number of people from the Australian Defence Force who are recruited into the Northern Territory Police, and that there is some material in the brief of evidence which suggests there are considerable skills that they bring that have crossover. For example, skills in terms of understanding search and rescue that might be very valuable. What are your experiences of, if any, of working with people who've been in the ADF?
I've worked with the ADF both within Australia and offshore. I've worked in operational theatre in the Solomon Islands with the ADF and the New Zealand Defence Force, the Papua New Guinean Defence Force. The roles that we play in society across the two agencies are different. However, there's a lot of crossover between the two, and I think in the bulk, across my time within the AFP and Northern Territory Police, the officers that I've worked with that have come from the Defence Force have been in the majority professional and adaptive in the workplace. So I can't say that I've seen any negative aspects other than some that have been brought to light in this inquest. And, you know, I wasn't part of the organisation then, and I haven't worked with those members.
I wanted to ask you about, just go back to recruitment for a moment. In terms of strategy to attract Aboriginal people into the role, have you got some ideas about it?
Yeah, I know that the Northern Territory Police is running a cadet program and a junior rangers program, but I don't see that as being available to some of our more disadvantaged kids. I think that on the ground engagement, which is what the correct command is trying to do, can address some of those issues. I think spending some time, well, we've got constables that are attached to high schools and middle schools, or senior schools, middle schools, and I think that's positive. But targeted recruitment, particularly at university level and tertiary education level, of Aboriginal people that have skill sets to bring to the organisation would be good.
In terms of the benefits of having more Aboriginal recruits, they might be obvious, but are there any examples you can draw from your own experiences where you've been able to have a particular relationship with a family, for example, getting someone to hand themselves in, avoiding conflict?
Yeah, it's not unusual, and it happens quite regularly here in Alice Springs. Recently, I had quite a violent incident involving a young man and a star picket with some of our members. It's currently before the courts, but we're able to have conversation with that young person's family and have the family bring him into the police station to be issued with a notice to appear, rather than proactively targeting him in the community. And there's a range of operational reasons why that was a positive thing to do. And yeah.
Were you involved in those negotiations with the family?
No, it was actually done by the Community Resilient Engagement Command, right, on my request, because they had the links directly to those families, and that's what that command brings to the table. We have some really strong Aboriginal liaison officers that are senior lawmen within their own tribal groups and communities, and women. Sorry, my apologies to the ladies, but senior men and women who have authority and influence within the wider Central Desert community, and it's really positive to be utilised, and it's safer for the community, it's safer for us. Obviously there's times when that's not an option for us to utilise, when it becomes a safety issue for the offender or for victims in the matter or for police officers. But when given the opportunity, I think that that's a very positive way to deal with things. I personally have had contact from offenders who have been outstanding on charges of serious harm, so serious violence charges. And I've had those young men actually drive past my house, pick me up in their car, and I brought them into the station, arrested them, and put them in the watch house. And that's what community relations can bring to the table. It's not always an option, but where it is an option, it's a positive option.
I'm going to deal with two more topics before I sit down for my colleagues. But Senior Constable, when we were speaking outside, you talked about some of your work with Strike Force Viper, where there are 10 to 16-year-old kids involved in property offences. And you mentioned that you're having to, having to detain sometimes young people who are likely to have FASD, poor impulse control, and be seriously disadvantaged. What's that like?
It's challenging. It's a difficult work environment. So some of the young people that we deal with day to day, and some of our constables that work within those units and within our youth teams, are very young themselves. But the young offenders, we try to get medical reports to support where they are and how they're affected. But with trainings provided by the police and with observations, you can see who are the children and at times that they're effective cognitively or they're effective in their ability to make complex decisions under stress. And we deal with quite a lot of those kids in the community here in Alice Springs.
And it often falls to police to deal with them at 2 or 3 in the morning, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I think the police are always the last port of call to deal with difficult situations. So a lot of the offending happens at night time. So it's the police who are out dealing with those young people at a time when they're vulnerable. I think on a whole, from what I've seen from working within Strike Force Viper within the last 6 months, where the bulk of young people's property offending is addressed, that it's done in a professional and effective manner.
What are your experiences of working with Territory families, for example, in getting some help for you as a police officer trying to assist the community?
Look, it's difficult. I can only see what I observe in my role.
Sure.
We deal with the children. We put in the Territory families reports that need to be done whenever we deal with a youth person. We don't always get to see, or very rarely do we get to see what response there is to that. But at 3 o'clock in the morning when we're dealing with, say, a 15-year-old youth who's committing offences, who may have some cognitive impairments or some impairments due to FASD, we don't have an on-call capability to come out to deal with that person. So our options are that the person's taken into custody and taken into the watch house, or that they're taken back and delivered into the care of a responsible adult, which isn't always possible. I would say that the bulk of the young people that we deal with who are recidivist offenders within the Alice Springs region come from broken homes or homes where it's not a safe environment for them. There may be alcohol and substance abuse, there may be other issues within the household, there may be no food. It hurts me to say this because these are my people, but that's the realities of what I see in my role day to day. The kids that are cared for effectively are home, they're going to school, they're living their normal lives. It's not those kids that we deal with in our role.
So Her Honour has some evidence in relation to Kumanjayi's experience. He was very loved by family and community, but we understand from the evidence that he may have had FASD. He certainly had poor impulse control. He appears to have had cognitive difficulties, which meant that he left school early. He had witnessed domestic violence. He went on to perpetrate domestic violence, and he had a history of trauma because both of his parents were deceased by the time he was a young fellow, around 10 or 11. Are they the bulk of that? Is that unusual for a presentation of a young person that you see, Senior Constable?
That would be on the upper end of the scale of the traumas that the young people that we deal with day to day face.
So he's not an isolated case. There's a number of young people you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
In terms of assistance from other agencies for police at the front line, what, in an ideal world, what do police need?
The capability to have somewhere safe to take children that don't have a safe environment for us to return them to, I think, is something that's really important. Nothing hurts me more than taking a child home at 4 o'clock in the morning to find everybody in the house drunk. No safe environment for the child, no food, no safe space for them to sleep in. And we understand.
The alternative is detention.
Sorry, Your Honour?
And the alternative is detention.
That's correct. And
even for a first offender, if there is no responsible adult that can be located, the alternative is detention. It should be a last resort, and you are not given any other option other than the last resort.
I would agree with that totally, Your Honour. I think that there's a failure in community capability, perhaps an NGO or perhaps Territory Families supported housing, especially for some of our middle to older teenagers, and for some of our younger offenders. And sadly, some of the children that we deal with between 10 and 13 years of age, they're tiny. They struggle at home with the same issues that I've just spoken about. And at times we take those children into custody because we don't have an alternative, and then we can't find a responsible adult. We have several children here in Alice Springs where their own families are refusing to come into the watch house to pick them up because they're either frustrated with their behaviours or they're removed kinship-wise and family-wise, and they're just the person that's placed in the position of being responsible. It's difficult.
One thing, and then I will sit down, one thing you mentioned in your statement is needed is, or you would like to see, is the establishment of family investigations liaison officers, which was a concept from the AFP. Can you just tell us about that?
So the FILO role within the AFP is more based for multinational, international and interstate-based crime. So it's based more around the counter-terrorism sphere of operations or with disaster response. So I was trained as a FILO within the AFP, and, you know, part of my role, we dealt with the victims, families of victims from MH17, MH370, so from the Malaysian Airlines disasters. The families were our responsibility to deal with, to provide advice to provide support to take secondary DNA samples from. And whilst that's a far cry from the work that we're doing here in the Northern Territory, I see a correlation where it could be effective to deal with the offenders' families in serious crime matters and the victim's family in serious crime matters, and to keep them abreast and aware of the circumstances and the situations. One of the things that I have seen in the Northern Territory is, and it's exceptionally difficult given the operational resource implications within the NT and the remoteness of some of our stations, but what we should be aiming for is to provide a family at Yuendamu with the same or similar support services, policing response that they would receive if they live in Sydney.
There are, it's fair to say, significant more resources that are required to assist the Northern Territory to deal with that. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, officers.
I need to check with you timing and availability.
Sergeant Allen is on a plane at 7 p.m, Your Honour, so he has kindly offered to sit until 5:30 p.m, and then someone can whisk him off. Senior Constable Wallace has rearranged his schedule. He actually needs to drive to Darwin tomorrow, but we could keep him till 11 p.m. I think he's happy. So 5:30 I think we should aim for, Your Honour.
Have you discussed that with...
I have, and our court officers kindly agreed to sit till then too.
All right, thank you. Questions? Mr. Essendon.
Sergeant and Constable, my name's SBIP on behalf of Naja. Constable Wallace, you spent some time coordinating or running the community safety patrols or the night patrols with the Shire. Just trying to rush through it, just to correct me if I'm wrong, that was for about 12 months, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So from 2009 to 2010.
Naja is, amongst other things, has or conducts community legal education primarily in the top end, but also in the community of Bajamanu, providing legal education for night patrol staff in a number of communities. I just have a couple of questions about your time in that role. Obviously, did your work also involve training those staff, or was it more management and?
It did involve training the staff. I actually I liaised with a company at the time called Eagle Training, which was a security-based training company, but we worked together to put a training package that would be somewhat appropriate for patrollers working on communities, because prior to that time there had been very little proper training given to them. So we ran some basic safety courses, some courses about positive communication and dealing with conflict and dealing with trauma, four-wheel drive courses because they travel vast distances as part of their role. So within the auspices and the budget that was given to me, I tried my best to give them some form of training.
Right. You mentioned the word budget. I guess generally speaking, as those teams are first responders to a lot of incidents that occur after hours, during the evenings, generally in communities they're the only people working throughout the night. I guess just interested in whether you think they're adequately resourced for that work.
100% not. They weren't resourced adequately in 2009 when I worked with them, and my dealings with them on communities since I've been back with Northern Territory Police and prior in my role with the Australian Federal Police when I visited remote communities, they're not adequately resourced, trained or funded for what they do and the role they play within their community. Most of the night patrollers within communities in Central Australia are authoritative, influential Aboriginal people within their own culture and kinship groups. That education is gained through immersion in ceremony and culture from the time that they could walk. You can't buy that, you can't train that. It's so imperative and important for those people to be given support to provide their service on their community as a first response, and I see it as being exceptionally valuable.
Various times there's been funding in various communities for not only just the night patrol but day patrols or wardens and that sort of thing as well. As would you agree the hours that they operate could be extended and could operate alongside the role of police in communities?
I've actually quite often had that thought to myself about the incorporation of some form of night patrol of those workers with the police, but I think that there's definitely a separate role, because what I tried to get my night patrollers to focus on, and if you wanted to engage this more, if you speak to Patrick Torres from Northern Territory Corrections, he worked with me at the time, he could provide further information, was we encouraged our night patrollers to attend incidences where safe to divert people from the justice system. So it was to provide a community response to a situation that may alleviate the need for police to attend if it was not a violence-related offence, and they could mediate the situation within their own cultural knowledge based on their own skill level, and that would at times alleviate the requirement for police.
So it's quite often very preventative work that they do.
Absolutely.
One issue that often arises in just staff having conversations with night patrol is the concerns or frustrations of being, using that term, first responders, and after hours not being able to get through to local police, and phone calls being diverted to the call centre, in the absence of any other sort of direct communication that they otherwise could have with the police. So in other words, they simply go through the same process as a general member of the public if they call police after hours. Is that something you're aware of in your time working with night patrols, or more broadly working with the Community Resilience and Engagement Command? Or
Absolutely, albeit it was 13 years ago that I worked within that portfolio for Central Desert Shire. Quite frankly, there simply isn't enough police in our remote communities to police 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Police officers, contrary to popular belief, are still human. They require break times, they require rest, they require food. And I know myself, I've conducted a lot of relieving roles throughout the Central Desert as a station OIC and as a constable at multiple stations, that you very quickly become exhausted. And when you become exhausted, then at times management from our organisation step in and tell you, unless it's a absolutely necessary commitment for you to go out, a matter of life and death, that you need to take that rest period and break time. And it does make it difficult. The easy measure for that is to recruit twice the number of police to work our remote communities, which in a perfect world, I would say would be a great response.
Is that an issue that has arisen in the MOUs that you developed between police and night patrol?
I don't even know if those MOUs are still in place. I know that the sergeants that I worked with to create those MOUs are no longer in any of the positions where I was working, because such a great time's lapsed that many of them have moved on, retired, or otherwise from the organisation.
Right. Another issue raised in that situation is the concerns of ringing call centres and getting people in down that either are unfamiliar with the language or accents of people from those communities, or familiar with the local places. I'm anticipating your answer, but do you think there's more could be done to perhaps recruit, in your answers about recruiting more Aboriginal people, that all levels of employment, including places like police call centres, having localised community, people, Aboriginal people, able to take those calls that might be a bit more familiar with various communities and regions? Is that something that may assist in these sort of after hours interactions?
It'd certainly be beneficial, but our call centres operate out of Darwin. It's a centralised platform. So I'm unsure how many current spoken languages there are within the Northern Territory, but I envisage it'll be well over 100, if not 200 or 300. So to have a call centre staffed 24/7 with people from each and every language group would be exceptionally difficult. I don't think it's practical to have call centres at remote stations, because police officers are out working operationally. They're not always at the remote station. So that's why I believe the system is set up the way that it is. So yes, I agree in concept that would be beneficial. I understand the difficulties involved with trying to implement it.
Right. And you advocate for generally more Aboriginal police being recruited and proactive policing as a way of attracting more police or more Aboriginal people to becoming police officers. We've heard evidence from a number of police around the challenges of recruiting ACPOs in communities. you aware of what sort of differences they may have in relation to salaries and awards that are provided for Aboriginal community police officers?
So Aboriginal community police officers and police officers both get a housing allowance from Northern Territory Police as part of the salary package. I understand that a ACPO pay scale is slightly different to a constable pay scale. And I think that's reflective of the level of training, but I don't think that that's reflective of their cultural knowledge base and cultural training that they can bring to the organisation, including language skills.
Right, that was going to be my next question. Whether there's enough factoring in of the different skills that Aboriginal police may have. You also referred in your statement to the unique stresses of policing your own community. Is that something that should also be factored in to things like salary and awards?
There's nothing more difficult than going to a death, violent or otherwise, of a family member wearing a uniform. I'll make that abundantly clear. It's hard as a police officer in any circumstance to do that, but with our Aboriginal police officers, especially if they're working within their own home environments, that's what we're asking them to do. I've been to deaths of my own family members. It's exceptionally confronting. Is there any way to recompense for that? I don't think so. Can we prepare our members for that through training and effective mentoring and leadership and support? Yes, I think so. One thing I do know is working side by side with our non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous colleagues from any ethnicity or culture, I believe it makes the job easier on the given day, having a bit of local knowledge.
Right.
Can I just ask you, you said there was a housing allowance, but houses, as I understand it, are provided to police officers in remote communities, but I don't know that they are offered or provided to ACPOs.
Your Honour, from my understanding, ACPOs and the constable stream, which includes all ranks, is entitled to either a home or a housing allowance.
Thanks.
I think you just mentioned having people with local knowledge alongside, like yourself, alongside non-Aboriginal members is an extreme benefit to be able to provide local knowledge of people and places and history of families and that sort of thing.
Yep, absolutely.
How often, as a local Aranda person, do you get, for example, not only having to upskill your fellow members, but how often do you get the situation of family members reaching out directly to you? I think you gave an example of someone turning up, asking you to drive them to the station and arrest them. Is that something that's also an additional challenge, or perhaps a barrier to other people wanting to join the force?
Look, choosing the path to work in law enforcement within your own community, whether you're an Aboriginal person working within the Northern Territory or you're a Lebanese person working in Sydney or an Asian person working in Melbourne, is exceptionally challenging within your own community and environment. I don't think it would be any different from a young person who has grown up in Western Sydney in some of the lower socioeconomic areas to wear the blue and go home and police his own. It's difficult to police where you come from. I don't think being Aboriginal makes that exclusively hard. I think what makes it hard for us is that we police within our own country, our own land, with our own kinship, familial group, with people who we have ceremonial responsibilities to. It can be exceptionally difficult. The support from my family, for example, is very strong. However, I have members of my family that have changed attitudes towards me because of what I do. I try to maintain my own personal integrity. I'm no angel, but it's one of the most challenging things that somebody can do. And if you look at the history of Aboriginal police officers within the Northern Territory, we've had some exceptional human beings who have come from our communities that have performed those roles in our communities. And straight to mind would be some of the older gentlemen that performed roles at Yuendamu and Kintor and Papunya and Santa Teresa, and within the Northern Territory Police, those individuals are recognised and their contribution is highly valued by the organisation, especially if you talk to the older police officers who worked side by side with them. They're more than happy to express how much benefit they brought to the role. And I think it's something that perhaps as time has passed has become a little bit undervalued.
Mr. Espy, I'm really going to have to suggest that you've only got one question more unless there's... I know that it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate, Your Honour. This is only the second Aboriginal police officer that's appeared since week one.
If he was going to be available for any time tomorrow, I would give you some more time, but it doesn't sound like he can be.
I'm getting whispers he may be able to come back, Your Honour, so perhaps I'll ask one more question. But
I have to run that by the
It
second
doesn't
constable.
have to be tomorrow, like we could come back.
He's not available tomorrow.
May I just say too, for the Brown, Walker, Lane and Robertson families, I've got quite a number of questions that I would really appreciate if Senior Constable could come back and I could focus on the questions I have for Sergeant Allen in the next little while. I apologise, I just thought I'd mention that now.
No, that's fine. The only reason I'm leaving tomorrow is because I've got a funeral to attend on Saturday in Darwin, and I need my vehicle up there, so I need to drive up tomorrow. But I'm available if there's a requirement for me to come back.
Some further time in the next period of time, because obviously there are a lot of important questions for you from various parties. So, Mr.
If that's a possibility, Your Honour, perhaps I'll reserve any further questions and sit down
I think
now.
so.
Thank you, Constable.
Yes, Ms. Moreau.
Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you, officers. My name's Paula Moreau and I'm asking questions on behalf of the Brown, Walker, Lane and Robertson families who are the families of Kumanjayi Walker. I wanted to start with the training matters that you've been discussing and particularly asking whether or not there has been any moves to permit officers who are already in the force and have been in the force for some time to have the benefit of the cultural training that you've been speaking of that is now available for the new recruits?
No. No is the short answer. I can see the benefit in it. Being an experienced officer myself, I've got a great deal of benefit by having those interactions myself. I can see the benefit of it, yeah, for sure. What we have rolled out across the agency is the online Northern Territory Government cross-cultural training package, but I agree it's not as powerful as the face-to-face interactions.
In-person reflection and learning from people who hold that cultural knowledge.
The significant challenge is it's place-based, location-based. So if we reverse engineer it and look at recruiting of Aboriginal liaison officers, the direction of the Community Resilience Engagement Command in that respect, you could have an Aboriginal liaison officer at Umbakamba, Anurigu, that has so much knowledge and value to that area that you couldn't teach me that in 23 years, every day sort of thing. So that's the challenge.
And if we were speaking and thinking creatively about it, and in terms of rolling this out more broadly to recruits and talking about catching those that may not have had that benefit in the past, it could be locally based, couldn't it? If there are enough educators who could be in the regions to provide that to the officers that are there.
Certainly. And it comes down to local procedures, leadership, initiative, and we were talking while we were waiting to give evidence about it'd be great to have a forum or a collection of the experienced officers would meet regularly throughout the jurisdiction and discuss their localised issues from that experienced officer, Indigenous officer point of view.
Can I also ask, I assume from your answers that you would think that extending this program to serving officers is a positive thing and perhaps is something that should be taken on board?
Yes, I do, but the challenge is the location-based, yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
What about the regularity of cultural training? Do you see any benefit in refresher courses for officers throughout their career? And it can be, of course, slightly more advanced and more localised as people have more experience. But do you see any need for refresher cultural awareness, bias training, those sorts of things to be brought back to on a regular level to all officers?
If I take you back to the methodology in the college, is with that research program, is giving them the tools and method to go to wherever they get posted throughout their career and adopt that methodology to learn about and increase their knowledge and speak to the right people in the right places. That's a way of getting that broader across the territory. Local training, on-the-job requirements, leadership can really fit that void of the officer in charge of a police station. We haven't spoken about inductions.
It's one of my questions as well. But yes.
A lot more can be done in relation to inductions and the cultural aspect to inductions for, in particular, officers in charge. And then the responsibility from a leadership point of view can be put on those individuals to help bring their members, talk to the right people, discuss the right issues, the local issues.
Can I ask both of you then what your ideas are in that space for inductions? I saw Senior Constable Wallace in your statement that how important it would be that these be localised issues and that there be sufficient information for all the police officers in the station and have that leadership of the OIC being particularly involved, but to have cultural knowledge available and to have the capacity for officers to be able to grow while they're posted in a location. What are both of your thoughts on those packages?
My view is strongly on location-based. At the college in particular is the broad methodology, but once you get to your station, because they could be going to 3, 4 throughout their career, but in particular their first station, I would love to see the induction process be very structured, formalised and also accountable in terms of the documents are fine, the documents are beneficial, but when there's local contacts, local areas, key people in the community, have they gone and actually met these individuals?
And
So,
perhaps even ensured that the elders from those communities are, that the cultural protocols and the arrangements are consistent and informed by their own, they have a contribution to that as well.
So my view, strong leadership, remote communities, localised, and certainly a lot more work can be done in that area.
Senior Constable Wallace.
I agree with Sergeant Allen. I think that there's definitely scope and space for an improvement in the way that our members are inducted into remote communities. I think that there's space for the Community Resilience Engagement Command to have an impact there. Our Aboriginal liaison officers that work in that space are embedded in our stations, and we're trying, from my understanding, as an organisation, we're trying to have them represented at each and every remote station.
So, out of 20 remote communities, I think we've got representation of around 40 Aboriginal liaison officers. Obviously, having been involved in the training process and seeing, and to assist with the question from the Naja lawyer, what drives, it's an individual drive, I believe, in my view, that gets the Aboriginal liaison officer, the Aboriginal community officer, to make a difference in that community. That's their drive to help, above all the family pressures. But the Aboriginal liaison officer program, in its infancy, it'd be great to see that a representative across all the remote stations in the territory, northern, southern, central, Barkly.
That's where the education base can come from to provide that cultural knowledge and experience to our members from remote communities. If they have a member of the correct team who's embedded as part of their team, speaks language, knows the local stakeholders, is able to explain cultural networking and cultural brokerage within the community, that's imperative. I mean, we work in such a diverse variety of locations throughout the Northern Territory, and notwithstanding or forgetting the fact that we're there to work as law enforcement within that community. So there's times when it's challenging, and whereas members of the police service, we're required to uphold and enact legislation which at times requires a use of force. But I think that there's options that can be explored before we get to that point in time.
And that sort of leads into another question I have. What about in training, the embedding of Aboriginal people and perspectives in the more traditional aspects of policing, like use of force, like de-escalation tactics, and like tactical decision making, and how those knowledges can actually affect policing in those more traditional areas, not just through cultural awareness and knowledge and building that up, but also informing the development of policy and how people interact in their daily policing lives.
From a use of force perspective, is that where your question's going?
Yeah, well, I expect that there are ways of communicating and there are ways of responding to incidents that may actually benefit from Aboriginal knowledge and perspectives, and that, I guess, happens at training, and I'm wondering whether you have had any thoughts along those lines.
No, not until you've mentioned it. Also, from a instructor point of view, we do have operational safety, an operational safety section, as I said earlier in my evidence, Your Honour, that deal with use of force, operational safety, defensive tactics. Probably better placed to provide an opinion or view on that. But
Can I ask whether, sorry, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's
Can I ask whether at the end of the cultural competency training in the Institute with the recruits, is there an assessment that's made of progress there?
With the training environment, competent, not yet competent in relation to an assessment. However, it's the process that's the most valuable commodity, I suppose, in relation to the whole thing. It's a group activity. I don't know if I explained that clearly at the start, but
The assignment process that
yeah,
we discussed.
it's a
Yes,
group
sort of
activity.
understand.
It's a group presentation, and quite frankly, if any group with your supervision of the squad are falling behind, not looking like they're doing anything to meet the benchmark, and provide a presentation in front of the management at the college, our invited guests, that is below mark, certainly would have to be corrective action in relation to that. But fortunately, I haven't seen anything in relation to that. Is it a 9 out of 10, 8.5 out of 10, 70%, 95% mark? No, it's not.
And then finally on the training issues, is there support or moves towards promoting advanced learning of the kind that yourself took, Senior Constable Wallace, for members in the police force, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to be able to bring and to be sort of cultural leaders and to assist other police officers along the way? I know there's been moves in that direction in terms of the domestic violence space and mental health space in Queensland. I'm aware of that, where people are going in and doing advanced training to be leaders in their communities. Is that something that's spoken about or thought of as being useful here in terms of both cultural training and incorporating those culturally safe practices within policing?
From my awareness, no.
Miss Moreau,
Yes.
you might get another chance.
Thank you.
Just before we lose the panel tonight, if anyone has just one important question to ask before they leave, I'll let you ask one question. But otherwise, we might be able to reconvene later. No?
I'll have a shot.
Okay.
This is you sat down because you're not coming back. With regard to the Northern Territory, it's about a quarter to a third of the population is Aboriginal, about 100% or thereabouts of young people detained are Aboriginal, 80 to 90% of adults detained are Aboriginal. Your training program is about, say, 25, 26 weeks. And I preface this question by congratulating you both on the fantastic work that you've been talking about. It's not a criticism of you, this question. But I'm suggesting that, given the data I've just told you about, you provide about NT Police provides about 5 to 6 days of training, maybe 7, on, let's say, Aboriginal issues, Aboriginal culture and so on. But the data is very much at odds with that 4 or 5% of your whole training deals with what is in fact maybe 80 or 90% of your work. So can I ask for your comment, perhaps suggest to you that there's quite a large philosophical and structural change which is needed in the training college, which is that instead of 5 or 6 days, maybe 7, you really should be thinking about weeks and weeks of training in Aboriginal culture, and that you use that for 2 reasons. Firstly, so that your police are much better trained at dealing with Aboriginal culture and issues, and much better grounded for their whole careers. And secondly, on a rare positive note, that, from me anyway, that you would be able to use that as a strong selling point, that anyone coming out of your college would better trained than any police force anywhere on the whole question of working with the Indigenous population that they serve and police. So that would become a strong leadership point, a strong pulling point for the NT police, and also have a great practical effect in how good you were at policing if your trainees were given a great deal more training in Aboriginal culture.
Your Honour, my answer to the previous question has a lot of relevance to my answer to that question in relation to the ALO program, and my example about my experience as a police officer and being able to reach out to an Aboriginal liaison officer at a particular community has got incredible knowledge, cultural understanding that I could probably never get if I sat in a classroom for or a training environment all day, every day. But I don't dispute the calculation in terms of the significant proportion of Indigenous population in the Northern Territory, vast contrast to the rest of Australia. Don't dispute that. Don't dispute the challenges presented by those statistics from police officers. And I also don't dispute, through my evidence, if you were to add up the hours, we're sitting about 6-7 days constant cultural awareness training. Also need to understand about the research project that's ongoing and the references throughout the training to cultural issues, whether it be through the moot court process, brief compilation. But I'll finish in summary. It's in its infancy. There's no formal review of what I've given evidence about today. From a policing point of view, we've got a learning development section. We're a registered training authority. The induction team, our management at the college haven't done a review of what I've presented the evidence for, and it's evolved ever in the short time I've been there. So in terms of timeframes and additional opportunity for training, I open arms with what more could be done in that space given the challenges the police have. And my answers back to the previous colleagues is still in relation to the challenge of this location-specific cultural awareness training. It's 50 remote communities across the territory. The challenge is how do we get that in this environment at the college? And that's why it's so important, the liaison officer program and building that. So I don't dispute both. I think further work can be done. It's all
And very much a formalisation of what is required in an induction at the various locations when an officer is sent to one of those locations, so that is formalised training and that competencies need to be reached.
It's not go read this document before you get out there. Read the document, meet individuals, make it accountable that it's actually occurred. So my answer is I agree, but I don't. There's more work to be done, but I don't know what the machine's going to look like going forward.
Yes.
Oh, my time's up.
It is. Sorry, I think everybody's. Did you have one?
I've got one, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you, Anna.
And then we'll have to work out where we go to from here. But your one question.
Dr. Freckleton.
Thank you. From your respective perspectives, no doubt you've both been receiving feedback from Indigenous and non-Indigenous police colleagues about the revelations of racism, sexism and so on in the course of this inquest. Assuming that you have been receiving such feedback, how do you think it can be harnessed constructively? Perhaps starting with you, Senior Constable.
The revelations that there was instances of private messaging, racist comments that were disgusting and horrible shocked me and it hurt me, but it didn't surprise me because we're a representation of mainstream Australia in policing. So where I think it can be positive is that it's been raised in this inquest that Northern Territory Police are aware of it and that we acknowledge that we don't accept it, we don't tolerate it, and that we will not have that as part of this organisation, this uniform, this brand moving forward. There is no place in any level of society that's acceptable in 2022 where that type of behaviour is acceptable. And that's whether it's in the format of racism, misogyny, or any other form of hate against any individual group, ethnicity, sexuality within our society. How is that ever acceptable today?
Sergeant, from your training perspective?
Zero tolerance. In terms of this inquest, we've addressed every recruit in the training college about it's not the culture, it's appalling. It won't be tolerated, will not be tolerated. And Senior Constable Wallace said it earlier in his evidence, sometimes when your culture gets damaged like this, you've got to go back a little bit to go forward. There's a lot of positive things going. The police training environment has a fantastic culture. It's one of the better locations I've worked. Seeing the enthusiasm in the police officers that are working, getting up early for PT, turning up to their courses, studying on the weekends. They want to get out. They've been asked why they want to join. They document it all down. They're doing assignments in relation to code of conduct, what the oath means to them. It's a lot of positive in my workplace.
Thank you.
I am going to ask counsel assisting to consult with these witnesses about whether or not one or both of them might be able to return. I'm also going to ask counsel assisting to consult whether that last question and those answers, we might get permission for those to be rebroadcast. We do not normally permit rebroadcasting of the live stream. We'll adjourn till 9:30.
Just briefly, I'll let the witnesses go, but I've got a bit of housekeeping I just wanted to raise super quickly. And it is this, but Sergeant's got to get to the airport, so I just won't.
So you go.
Very quickly.
Thank you.
Tomorrow there is, thank you officers. Tomorrow there is one witness, Officer Agnew, who is going to give evidence, and then we're going to have a discussion about Yuendamu. So the Yuendamu visit is currently scheduled for 14th and 15th of November, and can I ask my learned friends to come with answers as to who will be seeking to attend. The second thing is this: Your Honour made an interim non-publication order with respect to the name of the person that Constable Rolfe had sent that text message for. My learned friend asked for 48 hours. 48 hours is lunchtime tomorrow. It occurs to me that we'll have some time in court to deal with any further arguments about that issue and for Your Honour to consider it and to hand down a ruling. So, thank you.
And Your Honour, I won't be here tomorrow, so I seek to be excused until court reconvenes after the 15th.
Sure.
I'm the same boat,
Okay.
Thank you.
So just if you make your position clear to council assisting in relation to the Uluru issues, that would be appreciated.
All stand. Coronial Court now stands adjourned.